I finally have MongoDB running locally, and I have it deployed in the cloud and running successfully there. So I'm going to walk you through all of the things I had to do to get this running. I thought it would be actually very quick and easy to do, but there were so many pieces I had to check, debug, and fix that I wanted to make sure I covered all of it. So I am using my example, which is cloud native to do, and when you go looking for it, it's going to be marked as 008, which is the database deployment. So it'll have both the database code in the API as well as all the infrastructure changes. So to get started, as a reminder of what the app looked like prior to this step, it was a simple React on the front end with Express on the back end. I can't really remember what's on the back end, but it's a Node app on the back end. They're both deployed as Azure Container Apps. If we refresh the API, we can see that an item got added. My front end caching is for some reason delayed, so it's not displaying quickly, but it is actually hitting the database in real time. And if we go over and look at the database in the Azure portal, you can see there are two objects there and pretty much look like what I added. So how did I add the infrastructure for MongoDB to my existing front-end and back-end infrastructure? So first of all, this has been the template I've been using, the to-do Node.js, but if you do Azure samples and then start with to-do and then search, you're going to find all of the infrastructure for container apps. And then I sort of followed it down the line. I'm basically employing exactly what they did in the app directory. I have an API and a web, and I added the database part. So in terms of what my actual steps were, here is a highlight of what they were. So I wanted to add the infrastructure and the API code to manage the cloud database. So I added Cosmos DB into the infrastructure. I had to deal with the connection string because the connection string as a secret would have been leaked through deployment logs, so I couldn't deal with the connection string itself. I had to stuff it into KeyVault. And then, of course, I had to add that code into my API to read it out of KeyVault. I also had to add some API, the resource name and the endpoint for KeyVault in order to be added to the container app environment so that the code could actually read it. Then I had to update the API to read those secrets. Let's see. And then I had to fix the mongoose code, which for some reason pluralizes collections, and I didn't want my collection pluralized, so I had to go off and find that fixed. All of the fixes are in the troubleshooting markdown file. Then the next step was I had to update the client. I had broken out in this step for the database, I had broken out the route into plural and singular routes, which was a change that had to go all the way back to the front end in order for the front end to work. And then in case you're wondering how that changed the response object, prior to this, the response object was just a singular with just title and ID, and now it has a few more pieces. The front end doesn't show those, that's fine, I'll deal with that in the next version. At this point, I believe I was getting some weird issue where everything would provision and the API would deploy, but the client wouldn't deploy for some reason, and I couldn't figure it out. So I basically had to stop everything, remove all of my cloud infrastructure. Then I killed all of my local containers, restarted everything again, redeployed again, and it started working. But before I did that, I did some other debugging steps, like I added a status route with a random password that's in the infrastructure. And then I added a whole bunch of debugging stuff, like I was spitting out environment variables to see how far through the process the deployment was getting and trying to figure out where it was stuck. That didn't actually help anything, but it did give me the idea that I probably should version the infrastructure. So I do have a changelog now here, and I have an infrastructure version. 3 just means the first version was the API, the second version was the client, and the third version is the database. So that's what the 3 means there. And then I did some moving of values up. I realized that when in the previous iteration, the client was deploying on port 80, and now that I had a full stack playwright test in CI in a GitHub action, it was getting permission denied because the port number of 80 was so low. So I needed to bump it up to something that I knew would get through the GitHub action CI requirements. So I changed it to 3005, but then I thought I need to pretty much make this clear all the way through because that number is used in several spots. So that's the summary of what happened.